Good afternoon, good morning, good day, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of the fall semester of 2025. It's a true damn series of webinars dedicated to political trust. And the topic of our webinar today is institutional trust and media use in times of cultural backlash. It's a study based on the cross-national survey in 9 European countries conducted in 2021. The study examines how trust in politics, media, and science is shaped by cultural backlash and media use, and the results suggest that both cultural and institutional dimensions of cultural backlash matter for explaining institutional trust. We are very pleased today to have our invited guest speaker, Marc Verboord, who is Professor of Media and Society at the Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication of Erasmus University Rotterdam. Marc's research is situated at the intersection of cultural and media sociology, communication science, and journalist studies. His expertise concerns sociological aspects of media consumption, societal impacts of digitalization and new media, trust, and cultural legitimation. He has published in more than 40 peer-reviewed scholarly journals, including American Sociological Review, New Media and Science, American Behavioral Scientist, Information Communication Society, European Sociological Review, and European Journal of Communication, Journalism, and Mass Communication Quarterly. He is also a member of the editorial board of Poetics, Journal of Empirical Research on Culture, the Media and the Arts, for which he also served as co-editor-in-chief between 2015 and 2021. Marc teaches in the International BA in Communication and Media, the Master Media Studies, and the Research Master Sociology of Culture, Media and the Arts. In between 2020 and 2023, Marc served as head of the Department of Media and Communication at the School of History, Culture and Communications at his university. Finally, in 2018, Marc was visiting professor at the University of Copenhagen in the Department of Media, Cognition and Communication. Marc, we are very pleased to have you today with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm very honored that I can present in your webinar. So I want to share some results today on the research that we did on institutional trust. This research was situated in an Horizon project. It's good to maybe sketch a little bit of the background of this project. It was the INVENT project, where we this is not good. It automatically changes. That's not good. So the European Inventory of Social Values of Culture as a basis for inclusive cultural policies in the globalizing world. So what we did was we focused on culture, how people interpreted culture, and also the effects of culture. The background was that we wanted to know more about how social megatrends influence the way of life of Europeans. And these were the megatrends that you see here on the screen. And we used various methods for that. Today I will present research from the survey that we did, but we also did other. We also used other data collection methods. So I think this is good to give a little bit of the background, because it was not only focused on trust or on the political element, but our project was in principle a broader project, and it was one of the side topics that we studied. So this paper focuses on institutional trust. So basically the degree to which citizens have confidence that institutions function to their best interest. And we see this very much as evaluative in nature, trust as evaluative in nature, but also with clear expectations for future behavior. Now, of course, there's a large tradition of studying institutional trust, and also trust in various types of institutions, whether this concerns politics, media, science. In this project that we did, we wanted to distinguish between, on the one hand, more political institutions that are dealing with more governmental and controlling roles, and the other hand, institutions which are more knowledge-based, like media and science. Also, the focus of our study was more on the explanatory role of culture rather than on the more economical explanations. At the time when we did our research, it was, as you will see, we collected data also still during the COVID pandemic in 2021. So yeah, the relevance was also, of course, besides the political polarization, which is has been now a problem for years in the various European countries, but also you could say the post-COVID-19 crisis, which was also still there. We were still towards the end of the crisis when we did our survey. Actually, our survey was also delayed because of the COVID-19 crisis. We had a couple of questions also in the survey. I will say a bit more about that in a moment. So yeah, previous studies have looked at both institutional explanations of trust and also cultural explanations of trust. So institutional explanations basically look more at the performance of institutions themselves. So these are also called endogenous explanations. So there it's really the idea that trust is being influenced by how institutions are doing. Are they doing what they are supposed to do according to citizens? And if not, that could lead to a decline of trust in institutions. On the other hand, there are also cultural explanations, which are more based on the socio-cultural values that individuals hold. So these are more exogenous. These are not really part of what institutions do. They are relatively independent on the performance. And of course, that can be linked very much also to the work on value studies, the world value survey studies that have been done. And for instance, Norris and Engelhardt worked on that. But it can also be linked to, let's say, the political viewpoints, studies on ideological extremism, the way that polarization is shaping current societies. So what we wanted to do is also contrast these two types of explanations of trust, the more institutional ones and the more cultural ones. And we wanted to add the angle of media use. So to what extent media use of people also relates to the trust that people have in institutions, particularly the role of social media as a kind of a challenger of legacy media. So we wanted to bring these frameworks together with new data. By the way, these are cross-sectional data, so of course that is a thing to look at because a lot of the cultural backlash theories, the original theory comes from a more longitudinal study. Try to bring these frameworks together, emphasizing the role of media use and cultural backlash. I will say more about that in a moment. So these were our research questions. To what extent do cultural backlash indicators and media use contribute to the explanation of institutional trust in selected European countries? Which dimensions of cultural backlash are the most important predictors of institutional trust? On the one hand, endogenous predictors, on the other hand, exogenous predictors. And finally, also, how do these explanations of trust differ between various types of institutional trust? So the theoretical background is, to a large degree, the work by Norris and Engelhardt on cultural backlash, which they present as a rejection of post-material and socially liberal values, like being in favor of environmental protection, holding up to democracy, the importance of democracy, respect for the rights of homosexuals, immigrants, etc. And they basically state in their research that cultural backlash implies a rejection of these values and a turn to more authoritarian values. In their research, they really link this also to generational change, to cohort changes, and they present their research also with data from the World Value and the European Value Survey. In our project, we wanted to try to, we didn't take really this generational element here. We didn't see it as a generational conflict. Also, because our data are not cross-sectional, so we cannot even distinguish between... Sorry? We cannot even distinguish between these elements. So we were trying to create indicators based upon the theory that we can also link to the two type of explanations, as mentioned before, the cultural and the institutional ones. Also, because we believe that cultural backlash could be actually could be part of all generations. We don't really have very clear expectations that this is only something which all the generations would turn to. So part of the aim was to develop these indicators. And we posed a couple of hypotheses based upon the theory. In terms of cultural explanations, we expected, first of all, obviously, that in terms of the values, social cultural values that people hold, that the more liberal and progressive these values are, the more trust people would have. More extremism in terms of ideology, we would expect less trust. And in terms of the institutional explanations, so when it's about the performance of institutions, we focused on the discontent that people could have towards social developments, either the state of the country, so the evaluation of how the country is doing in a number of ways, and on the other hand also their evaluation of how things have changed in the past 5 to 10 years. And the more discontent we hypothesize, the less trust there is. And we also take a look at political party support, because we basically see this, interpret this as that people voting for more challenger parties, so for parties which are a bit more extreme, that this can also be viewed as a type of protest vote. And that type of support, a more radical type of vote, would lead to less trust. So the more that people are more vote for central parties in the center, the more trust they would have. So these were the expectations that we had based upon cultural backlash theory. And then we also looked at the role of media use, and particularly comparing the difference between mainstream or legacy media versus more alternative and social media. And the hypothesis there were that the more that people would use legacy media or typical normal news websites, the more trust they would have. More use of social media and video platforms would lead to less trust, because there people would perhaps avoid the traditional journalistic media and would more look for their own opinions on social media, and because they want to avoid the more mainstream journalistic content. And then there's the comparative element in the research. We have different institutions. We look at trust in different institutions: national government, EU, news media, science. So also comparing how it works for various institutions. And we are comparing countries, because we're a European project, 9 different countries with different value systems, different media systems, and different social developments. So it's also interesting to compare these, although we didn't really propose very clear hypotheses there. But we did look at the differences that we found. So these are the countries that were part of the data collection. So the Netherlands, Spain, UK, Denmark, Finland, Switzerland, Croatia, Serbia, and France. And these are the Invent partners, and well, the survey agencies, different survey agencies conducted the survey. Survey was done between April and July 2021. Like I said, it was basically towards the, it was still in the pandemic, but at that point there was not a lockdown. We delayed the data collection, and we asked also a question about how people thought that the COVID pandemic impacted their lives. Which we also used in the analysis, and turned out not to have strong effects there. A dependent variable is trust in institutions. So on a scale from 1 to 7, national government, EU, news media, science and scientists. In the main analysis, we created a new measure, institutional trust, which turned out to be a reliable measure. In terms of the explanations, the cultural explanations, we measured progressive liberal values via 9 statements. For example, same-sex marriages should be allowed throughout Europe on a 5-point Likert scale. We used the CAT-PCA to get the underlying dimension. This is the results of the CAT-PCA. So you can have a view that there are different types of items there. We tried to tap into different parts of the cultural backlash ideas about climate change, same-sex marriage. It's about strong leaders and freedom of speech. It's about minority cultures. It's about the EU. So together, we found as first factor the more progressive liberal value scale. We used the same, partly the same items to also develop the ideological extremism scale. We followed there the work by Hanich et al., who also worked with World Value Survey actually at that time, basically coding more extreme viewpoints as more. So the more strongly agree, the more strongly disagree, that would be indicators for more extreme viewpoints on these items. And finally, we also, the final measure for cultural explanation was also a measure for cultural cosmopolitanism. These were 4 statements from a work from Cleveland. And you can see here on the slide one of the items. Also, this measure turned out to be a reliable measure. Then moving on to institutional explanations, we had basically 2 sets of items where we asked people about how they evaluated changes in society and also the current state of affairs in their society, in their country. So the evaluation of changes in society was for the past 5 to 10 years, different types of developments, because we were interested in these megatrends with regards to inequality and globalization. So we had different types of statements. We use an index score here, so it's not a reliable score, but we were more interested in the full range than in one specific focus point. So the same was done for the same way of measuring was done for the current state of affairs. Also there we had 8 statements, and also there we created a mean index score. Both of these scores expressed a particular degree of negativity. So the more people agreed with that things had gone worse, this was added up and led to a negativity score. These people were more negative about developments or the state of the country than the other people. And then we also look at political party preference. We asked which party they would vote for if there will be general elections tomorrow. The parties that they mentioned were all recoded into the chess scores. So that's a measure for the political parties across the world on various dimensions, and based upon the party profiles. So researchers have done that analysis, and the results of that analysis of party manifestos is publicly available, so it can be used for research. We use the left to right dimension of chess for the coding of the political parties. And we also use the quadratic term in the analysis to see if the effect of party preference would be curvilinear. And then we also added a couple of dummy variables for people who were not voting or voting blank or voting another party, because obviously not everybody states what party they would vote for. Media use was measured in terms of the news media, so how people stay informed about current affairs. We had 6 items: television, public service television, commercial television, printed press, domestic digital news sites, social media, video sharing, and we used the mean scores for these items. And then there are a couple of controls that we add in our multidimensional multivariate analysis. Cultural capital, age, gender. We also ask for the ancestry. People could tell that themselves which ancestry they thought they belonged to. Being religious, urban residence, life satisfaction. We also, like I said, we did ask for whether people thought they were negatively affected by COVID-19. But in the end, these results were not significant, so we left them out from the final results. We did check this, but it was not significant because I guess life satisfaction already explained quite a lot. A couple of results first in terms of the descriptives. This is results for trust in various institutions per country. Basically, you can see there are a couple of differences there. In terms of news media, it's relatively low in the UK and France, relatively high in the Netherlands, Finland, Denmark. This is all in line with what we would expect and what other studies have shown. Politics, also there you can see it's quite low in Croatia, France, Spain, UK, and it's high in the Netherlands and Finland, again, Denmark. So we see quite some different patterns in the trust variables. Science is relatively high trust in all countries. That's the yellow line that you can see in the first graph. The second graph is the values and the perceptions. The differences are relatively smaller, so it's more difficult to see the differences there between countries. In terms of values, they're slightly lower in France, Serbia, UK. Extremism is slightly lower in Switzerland and UK. But yeah, these differences are quite small or quite nuanced, one could say. So for the multivariate analysis, we conducted multi-level because the data are nested. About 15% of the explanation can be found at the country level. All the explanatory variables are ground mean centered, and we also weigh the results. A first model, basically this is just the demographics, so this is just the background of individuals. We can see here that overall women, older people, higher educated, and religious people have higher trust. So this is also quite in line with a lot of previous results. Not very surprising. We don't find any differences between, let's say, urban and more rural people living in more rural areas. We also did not find an effect of ancestry. Then, if we add the cultural explanation, so the more exogenous findings, then we see that it's mainly the progressive liberal values, so the values that people say they have, that has a strong impact on trust. So strong positive impact on trust. But we also see that the more extreme that the answers of individuals are, the lower the trust. So it does have also an additional effect. Cosmopolitanism has a small effect. Adding then the institutional explanations, the more endogenous variables, we see that these also strongly impact institutional trust. So people who are more negative about changes in society, but also people who are negative about the situation in their country, these people tend to have lower levels of trust. So that we can see clear negative effects there. Political party has a positive effect, but also the quadratic term is significant. So it means that in principle, the right-wing voting first has a positive effect, but later on the quadratic term is negative. So it becomes then negative, meaning indeed that the more central political preferences are the most trustful. Interesting to see is also that the dummy variables that we added, so people who voted for another party or who voted blank, also have a very negative impact on trust. So, which is also, yeah, I think in line with what one would expect, that people who are not voting, that partly this is also people who don't express a lot of trust in the system and perhaps therefore not vote. So it's also worthwhile to take that into account in the analysis. And these analyses are controlled for life satisfaction, which also has an impact. So overall, this model also shows that both cultural explanations and also institutional explanations are relevant when we talk about explaining the level of institutional trust of people. If we add media use, they also matter, but less. So the impact of media use is much smaller, but in line with our expectations, using public television and printed press are positively related to institutional trust, while social media and video platforms are negatively related to institutional trust. So this is also confirming the hypothesis. All the other variables are included in this model 4. This is the final model. And then we can also see at the explained variances. In the end, the explained variance of exogenous cultural backlash variables is a little bit lower than the endogenous. In other words, the values that people hold seem to be a bit less important than the institutional explanations. If we compare the different institutions, I highlighted a couple of coefficients where there seem to be like interesting differences. If you take a look at the exogenous indicators, there's a very strong effect of progressive liberal values on the EU. It's much stronger than the effect of national government. So EU is predicted much better by values than national government. Cosmopolitanism I highlighted there because it's interesting that it doesn't really have an effect on the politics or the media, but it did matter for science. It's not entirely sure how to interpret that. That's something for follow-up research. Extremism was related to all the first 3 indicators. If you look at the endogenous indicators, we see also a couple of interesting results. People are negative about changes. That seems to be related mostly to EU trust, but less to national government trust. But the situation in the country, that's more related to national government, which makes sense, I guess, because this is really a question that's also asked about the country, the situation in one's own country. So it's also what one would expect. But it's also quite a strong negative impact on news media. So that's also interesting to see. Political party, the chess scale, again, this is just like the situation in the country, that's stronger effect on the national government, more strongly than on EU or the other institutions. In terms of media use, obviously using media is very much related to the trust in the news media, so that's not a surprise, although perhaps it is worth highlighting that using more social media is negatively related to trusting the general news media, and also video platforms is smaller, more limited effect, but it's also negatively related. Other than that, we see very clear effects, particularly for predicting trust in national government, more than the EU. So these are, I think, a couple of interesting distinctions. If we have a more broader overview of how that works for different institutions, one can also look at the explained variance. And then we see that trust in national government is mostly explained by these endogenous variables, or in other words, dissatisfaction of the performance, one could say, and being negative about how things work. While the values are more important for predicting trust in the EU, trusting science, and partly trusting news and media, trust in news media. But there you can see that both of them actually there's quite imbalance. So trust in news media is explained both by exogenous and also endogenous indicators. Maybe I will, in view of the time, I will skip this slide. So I just explained this while showing the previous slide. Go to the country results. In bold, you basically can see that For all countries except Serbia, the socio-cultural values have the highest level of explained variance, more than the endogenous, more than the dissatisfaction. The yellow basically gives more like what is the relative strength compared to other countries, and then you can see that, for instance, in the Netherlands, is relatively high explained variances for both exogenous and endogenous variables, while, for instance, Switzerland and UK have lower explained variances. So for some countries, we're better able to explain differences in trust than for other countries. The column at the end, the total of explained variance, you can also see that Finland, the Netherlands, France, there we are able to explain quite a lot of the variation in trust. For other countries, it's more difficult to do so. I would say, bringing this back to one of the questions at the beginning, how can we explain this in terms of the media system in a country or the prosperity of a country? That's more difficult to interpret. So we couldn't really find very clear patterns here. We would have expected maybe some more clear patterns, but it's more difficult to interpret this in terms of how the media system functions or GDP or general trust levels. It's a bit more difficult to explain. For instance, France has a high level of explained variance, but it tends to be, in general, it's a low trust country, lower than the Scandinavian countries or the Netherlands, but still we are able to explain quite a lot here. So some conclusions, we find evidence that both endogenous and exogenous cultural factors shape institutional trust. We found some evidence for the importance of cultural backlash in the way that we measure this. Media use is less important for institutional trust, but we do find small positive effects for legacy media and small negative effects for social media. These variables do not explain away each other, so they work parallel. So it's not that we are able to interpret effects of other variables by a new variable. They all have their place in the explanatory model. Also, discontent that we observed cannot be explained away, cannot be equated to political party support. Also, these have additional explanational value for each other. In terms of polarization, we think that fighting polarization would be beneficial for trust because we see also these effects of extremism. And finally, I think cultural backlash is a useful approach for analyzing trust. I think that's also one of the findings of the paper. There are some limitations, obviously. The survey was not designed for this specific research question, so that's an important thing to remark. It was a more general survey. Many different topics were addressed. And there were a relatively limited number of items for values and for the discontent. So there are some limitations there. The theoretical distinction between endogenous and exogenous is also not always very easy to make. So there's also room for discussion there, I think. For instance, what about the political party support? How should one interpret that? Furthermore, trust, is this an outcome? Or is it also a predictor? If you look at the original work, cultural backlash theory, there they use it actually as an indicator for populist orientations. So there's also some theoretical debate possible about that. And of course, one can also ask whether full institutional trust is really desirable. Of course, we use this quantitative measure, which is used a lot in research, meaning that it goes from no trust to complete trust. Is complete trust really what we also would want? That's, of course, another issue to be discussed. In terms of the method, there is more analysis is possible. There were some differences between countries in terms of the agencies they used and also in the methods they used to collect the data. We tried to control for that as much as possible. And I think finally we should also consider that dissatisfaction is maybe not fully uncovered due to non-response. So, of course, it could be that people who are really dissatisfied don't even respond to this survey. I think that was it. I think I've used all my time, too much time maybe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marc. Very interesting study. So we are now open the floor for questions. So you have two possibilities. There is some applause for you, Mark. Please post your question in chat or raise your hand, and you can then share your question or comment directly.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if there will be any questions to specific pages in the presentation, but in principle you can. So while everybody is thinking and preparing their questions, I will allow myself to start. I have two questions, Mark. Actually, three.
Okay.
The first one is very simple. It's about the choice of countries, whether these were just countries which were on board the project or if there was some rationale behind selecting them for fieldwork. The second question is about the concept of cultural backlash. So, since the study was cross-sectional, how did you distinguish cultural backlash from general positions of conservatism or ideological right-wing attitudes? Was there any conceptual boundary, or were they rather treated as perhaps overlapping phenomena? And question number three concerns the cultural versus institutional predictors of trust. So, in your model, the discontent with the current situation in the country is treated as an indicator of institutional performance, so separate from the cultural backlash dimension. But would it be possible to imagine that this variable itself is influenced by cultural value orientations such as authoritarianism, anti-cosmopolitanism, or ideological extremism? And perhaps this introduces some indigeneity in the performance explanation. Was this discussed at the stage of analysis? Was there any collinearity or correlation between these different types of political attitudes? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. In terms of the countries, this was basically the countries which were part of the project. So we didn't indeed select the countries based on this research topic. But of course, there was differentiation in parts of Europe there. In terms of the cultural backlash, yeah, so the concept we took as inspiration, basically the general idea as the concept is used in the original book by Norris and Engelhardt, where we saw it more as a rejection of progressive liberal values. That was the starting point of thinking through the concept. And then we try to link that to the institutional and the cultural explanations, as were basically addressed in a lot of previous studies on explaining political and institutional trust. So the disadvantage there is that the original concept is very much also linked to generations, and it's originally they hypothesized that all the generations would be the ones that basically have started to reject more progressive and post-material values more than the younger generations. So in principle, through cohort replacement, more progressive values, postmodern values would become dominant in society. But their claim is basically all the generations have started to oppose this, this rejection basically leads to new types of voting behavior, and therefore populist authoritarian parties would come to power. So it's very much linked to generations, which for practical reasons we could not do because we didn't have the data for that. But also I think for theoretical reasons, we were wondering whether this was really necessarily the case, that it's really so much linked to generations. And we interpreted it more as the values that people embraced or rejected. But I have to admit that part of the operationalization, part of the way that we also conceptualized it, was of course restricted by the opportunity that we had with the data. So that's of course a restriction that we have. If we would have the full opportunity to think of this concept, to think through the concept again, we might also would have emphasized some different elements. in terms of the cultural and institutional predictors, I think you're right. I think that there is a bit of tension. Like I said in the limitations at the end, there is a little bit of tension between these two types of predictors. The only thing we could do, so there was not multicollinearity, so that didn't show up in the results. The only thing we could do was basically make sure they're both in the model to see whether we could explain one away through the other, basically. So, and that was not the case. So we could, as you saw, there were both of them did have a predictive value. But obviously, the institutional explanations were not perfect. Also, these were a result from the survey that was developed, being negative about changes in your country, being negative about particular mega developments. These are not the perfect indicators for evaluating performance of institutions, because then we would have stated, in line with political science research, we would have stated more issues like how well did your government do, or how well did this institution perform in your opinion? And we did not have these measures. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There is definitely a limitation there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Marc. Are there any other questions to Marc? Anything you wanted to know about trust, media, and backlash? Claudia, please.
Yeah, thanks for sharing these interesting insights. I have a more technical or methodological question. Was there a reason or a consideration behind that you chose different survey institutes? Was it financial or whatever, or part of the project? And did you see any influences about concerning data quality? Were there noticeable differences which were a result of these different institutes? And maybe I missed it. Were the surveys done online?
Thank you for these questions. Yeah, good questions. Yeah. So basically, we did check this. We controlled the analysis, the multivariate analysis. We controlled it for the way that the data were collected. So that's one thing that we did, because there were indeed differences. In Croatia and Serbia, some of the data was actually collected face to face. In other countries, it was like online panels that we used. It was a matter of finances and a matter of how the situation was in different countries. So indeed, in Croatia, Serbia, it was relatively cheap to do it face to face. So that was the reason that they went for that option. In other countries, most countries, it was much cheaper to do it for online panels. So what we did do indeed is we controlled for the way that the data was collected. That was one thing. And we used also weights to make sure that the data were representative. Because in some countries, there seemed to be a little bit of overrepresentation of higher educated, for instance, in the panel. So we used weights to repair that somehow. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course.
So there was a change of the method, like changing from written to oral. Did you recognize any method effects? Because I once did a project on method effects in hybrid surveys. So
yeah,
because you said it was cheaper, yes,
yeah.
But normally says when people can answer anonymous, they are more honest. But having in mind that Serbia is more kind of a skeptical country, did you see or did you look at changes maybe resulting from that?
I think there were a couple of very small significant effects of the method. So we did tease these out as much as possible. But of course, it's impossible to really estimate the full what would have happened if we would have a different methodology. But the only thing we could do was tease them out, and I think we did see indeed a small significant difference between ways of collecting the data. It's actually, we have it put in the appendix of the article. So if you look at the online appendix, you can also, we have added these analyses. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. We do that. Thanks for answering our questions.
Thank you, Claudia. Do we have any further questions for Marc?
Can I?
Yes, please, Elena.
Okay. Marc, thanks again for your wonderful research. And you built it on European data. And because I'm in North America now, I'm asking more about your hypothesis than data. As I can see, there are different level of institutional trust and different level of cultural backlash in different states and provinces in the US and Canada. I think perhaps there are also different factors which defined this regional difference. I think, what do you think? Maybe it's a structure of economy or something else. Just I would like to hear what you think.
Yeah, that is, of course, entirely possible. We didn't indeed, like I said in the beginning, we didn't really focus a lot on the economic elements. There's, of course, a large literature which is also focusing more on the political aspect. I think in general, the political science literature who's studying political trust, they often also look at the institutional explanations from an economic perspective. So they often look at how well the government is doing is then measured, for instance, in whether they are dealing with unemployment, for instance, and that's then that's part of the institutional explanations which we indeed did not do, but we could have done that, or it might actually be interesting to zoom more also into the European regions. We haven't done that. That would actually be also interesting to see whether in some countries like in France, there might also be, or UK, differences between regions in the country where there is relatively more discontent in particular regions where with high unemployment, for instance, compared to other regions. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Actually, unemployment is for sure it's a significant economic factor, but I meant more economic structure, like for example, between California and Texas, or Alberta and Ontario. So the regions with heavy industry think differently and trust differently, and more or less liberal than countries with more post-industrial economy. So yes, it could spread on Europe as well.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I think this also links back to the previous question on how to distinguish institutional cultural explanations, because it might be for a cross-sectional study very difficult to then disentangle these, let's say, these economical elements of how the economical structure is in a particular region versus how the cultural values are in that region, because it might be difficult to tease them apart. But if one would have more trend data, so if one would have data over time, then perhaps that would be easier, because then perhaps some of the economical structures change over time, and then one could see also whether cultural values change over time. So it could be that would be a way to tease out these different aspects, perhaps.
Yeah, but they are pretty long-lasting. Its economic structure is pretty long-lasting. That's why, say, in the States, some states vote this way or other a different way by decades, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a significant factor.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions to Marc? I don't see any hands raised. Marc, in your table, which compares the explained variance for different countries, I believe Croatia had the smallest amount of explained variance. Was there any comment from colleagues from Croatia as to why this might be the case? So obviously something else explains political trust in Croatia. Was there any hypothesis shared on this?
No, but I think in general the colleagues from Croatia and Serbia, they said that in general the trust levels in their countries are relatively low, so that quite a lot of people are disengaged and have a lot of trust in how the political system is working. So they see this as, they see themselves as kind of low trust countries in principle. But they also could not really help explaining why, what were the predictors of this trust. So it's more difficult to really explain what drives trust then in these countries. I think we have a different paper, follow-up paper of this was about predicting voting behavior, voting right-wing political parties, in which we did not use, obviously, the trust variable, but we did try to look at the relationship between values, media use on the one hand, and on the other hand, voting for right-wing political parties. And there we also was very low explained variances for Croatia and Serbia, which at that time could be explained more by that different democratic traditions in these countries. So coming from a post-communist era, where there is traditionally very low trust in politics and also different ideas about how democracy would work. So different ideas about what is actually then right-wing voting. But yes, I'm not an expert in that, so that's only preliminary ideas. Yeah.
Thank you, Marc. And we have one more question from Claudia.
Yes, thanks. My question is, you said the more people use social media or video platforms, the less trust is. Do you see any countries who have a very high usage of social media? And did you then find this link to be a direct link, or is there other factors influencing?
Well, we didn't immediately find that, no. But what we did find, not in this article, but again in the article where we are looking at the voting for right-wing parties, we did see relatively strong effects of social media in Croatia and Serbia. There's also existing research on from Stetka and Mihail, who looked at 4 Eastern European countries and how the media use and the trust in these countries is. I think they have as case studies Serbia, Czechia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, I believe. And basically, one of the conclusions there is that the public media in these countries are not trusted that much, because partly they have also been shaped by the governments. For instance, the country like Hungary, where the government has restructured public broadcasters, made it more like a mouthpiece of the government, and that drives people to social media. So what we see in some of these Eastern European countries is that there is relatively a lot of usage of social media and video platforms because they don't longer trust the mainstream media. So we should take into account the specific situation in the country in terms of media, the media system, and how the media work, before we can say what actually using social media means for trust and for political interest. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marc. So last chance to ask your question to Marc. I think we have exhausted our questions. Thank you so much, Marc. It was a very interesting presentation, very interesting study. We appreciate you greatly coming here, and thank you very much for your time. And the webinar will be available on YouTube shortly, and everyone is welcome to join us for the next session later this month. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And good luck with the project.
Thank you.